In 1882, when Miriam Yoder found herself stripped of everything and auctioned like cattle on a Wyoming Territory platform, she clutched a small wooden star, the last gift from her dead brother, never imagining it would become the first of many that would light her path to an impossible love. A mysterious mountain man's unexpected bid would rescue her from public humiliation. But as winter stars blazed over their remote cabin, could two broken souls truly heal each other? Or would the shadows of her Amish past drag her back into darkness? Step right up and see what we got for sale today. The auctioneer's voice rang out across Cedar Falls' main street on a blazing hot day in 1882. Dust swirled around wooden boots and worn leather as men gathered in the Wyoming Territory town square. They came for horses, farm tools, and furniture, but today offered something different. Something that made even the roughest cowboys stop and stare. Miriam Yoder's bare feet burned against the wooden platform. Her plain gray dress, torn at the shoulder from rough handling, marked her as different from the painted ladies who usually drew men's attention. Dark hair escaped from its simple pins, framing a face that held secrets these frontier men couldn't understand. She kept her chin up, but her heart pounded like thunder in her chest. The crowd pressed closer. Tobacco-stained teeth showed in ugly grins. Whiskey breath mixed with summer heat made the air thick and hard to breathe. These men looked at her like she was a prize horse, not a person with feelings and dreams. "This here's an Amish girl," the auctioneer announced, sweat dripping down his red face. "Her family owed money they couldn't pay. Sheriff says she goes to whoever bids highest." His gavel hit the wooden stand with a sharp crack that made Miriam jump. She remembered her parents' gentle faces, now cold in the ground for 3 months. The fever had taken them quickly, leaving debts that grew like weeds. Her younger brother Daniel had died the winter before, coughing blood until his small body gave up fighting. Before he passed, he'd carved her a wooden star with his pocket knife, hands shaking from weakness. That star lived in her apron pocket now. Her fingers found it, holding tight to the only piece of home she had left. The smooth wood felt warm from her touch, like Daniel's hand might have felt if he'd lived to hold hers today. "What am I bid for this strong young woman?" The auctioneer's words hit her like stones thrown at a barn wall. Voices called out numbers: $20, $35, $50. Each bid made her stomach twist tighter. A man with gold teeth stepped forward, his eyes crawling over her like ants on honey. "She looks healthy enough. Can she cook and clean?" He reached toward her arm as if to test her strength. "Don't touch the merchandise until you own it," the auctioneer warned. But he laughed as he said it. Miriam pulled back, her heart racing faster. She'd heard stories about what happened to women bought at auctions. Some became wives to lonely men. Others became servants, working without pay until they died. A few simply disappeared into the wilderness, never seen again. The bidding climbed higher. $60, $75. The gold-toothed man kept raising his hand, grinning like a wolf that smelled fresh meat. Other men joined in, their voices getting louder and meaner as the price rose. $100, shouted a rancher with a dirty hat. His clothes smelled like cattle and old sweat. $125, called another, this one missing half his teeth. Miriam's legs felt weak. She wanted to run, but armed men stood around the platform, making sure she stayed put. The sheriff watched from the shade, picking his teeth with a small stick. He'd been kind to her parents when they were alive, but business was business. The sun beat down harder. Sweat ran down her back, making her dress stick to her skin. Her mouth felt dry as old leather. She thought about her quiet Amish community, where women wore long dresses and spoke softly, where men tipped their hats respectfully, and children played simple games in green fields. This place felt like the opposite of everything she'd known. Here, men bought people like they bought tools or animals. Here, kindness seemed as rare as snow in July. $150. The gold-toothed man's voice rose above the others. He pulled coins from his pocket, showing them off like prizes. "I got cash money right here." The crowd grew quiet, waiting to see if anyone would bid higher. Miriam closed her eyes, trying to pray, but the words wouldn't come. How could God let this happen to someone who'd never hurt a soul? "Going once," the auctioneer called. Her fingers squeezed the wooden star until its points pressed into her palm. Daniel's voice seemed to whisper in her memory, "Don't give up, Miriam. Stars shine brightest in the darkest sky." "Going twice." A new sound cut through the air, the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. Heavy footsteps approached the crowd, but Miriam couldn't see who made them. The men in front of her shifted and moved, creating a path for someone walking toward the platform. She heard whispers. "That's him. Didn't expect to see him in town. Wonder what he wants." The footsteps stopped. A deep voice spoke from somewhere behind the crowd, calm and steady like a river running over smooth stones. $500. The words fell on the square like a thunderclap. Every head turned. Every voice stopped. Even the auctioneer's mouth hung open for a long moment before he found his voice again. Who was this mysterious man? And why would he pay so much for a stranger? The silence stretched like a tight rope about to snap. Men stepped aside, creating a narrow path through the crowd. Miriam saw him then, tall as a pine tree, with shoulders broad enough to carry the world's troubles. His hair showed gray at the temples, like frost on dark branches. Lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting at mountain distances and weather that could kill the unprepared. He moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, as if these rough frontier men were simply tall grass parting before a gentle wind. His clothes were clean but worn leather vest over a blue shirt, pants that had seen honest work, boots made for walking hard trails. A rifle rested easy in the crook of his arm, not threatening, but present, like a promise that didn't need to be spoken. "Ezra Callahan," someone whispered, "lives up in the high country. Heard he can shoot the eye out of an eagle at 200 yards, said another voice, hushed with respect and maybe a little fear. "Keeps to himself since his family died." Miriam had never heard these names or stories, but she could see truth in the way men looked at this stranger. They respected him, maybe feared him a little, but nobody seemed eager to cross him. He carried himself like a man who'd faced hard times and come through stronger but sadder. The gold-toothed man who'd been bidding stepped back, his confident grin melting like butter in the sun. "500's a lot of money for any woman," he said, but his voice shook slightly. "You sure you want to spend that much on this one?" Ezra Callahan's dark eyes fixed on the speaker. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just looked at the man with the kind of steady gaze that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. "I'm sure," he said simply. The auctioneer found his voice again, though it cracked like a boy's. $500. That's the highest bid I've heard in 10 years of doing this job." He looked around the crowd, hoping someone else might compete with this legendary mountain man. Nobody moved. Going once, going twice. Sold to Ezra Callahan. The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot, but this time it meant freedom instead of fear. Ezra approached the platform, his spurs jingling softly with each step. Up close, Miriam could see kindness in his weathered face, though it was buried deep under layers of pain and loneliness. His eyes held the same lost look she sometimes caught in her own reflection, the expression of someone who'd loved deeply and lost everything. "Ma'am?" he said, touching the brim of his hat politely. His voice was gentle, like her father's had been when he spoke to frightened animals. "My name's Ezra Callahan. I know this situation isn't what you'd choose, but I give you my word, you'll be safe with me." He reached up to help her down from the platform, his calloused hand steady and warm. She took it carefully, still clutching her brother's wooden star with the other hand. As her feet touched the dusty ground, she felt the first spark of hope she'd known since her parents died. "I'm Miriam," she said quietly. "Miriam Yoder. Pleased to meet you, Miss Yoder." He kept his tone respectful, like she was a lady he'd met at church, instead of someone he'd just bought at auction. "I have a cabin up in the mountains where you can rest and think about what you'd like to do next." The crowd began to break up. men wandering away in small groups, talking in low voices about what they'd witnessed. The gold-toothed man shot dark looks at Ezra's back, but didn't dare say anything where the mountain man might hear. The sheriff counted his fees and tucked the money into his vest pocket, his job done for the day. "I don't have anything," Miriam said as Ezra led her toward 2 horses tied to a post near the general store. "Just what I'm wearing and—" She touched her apron pocket where the wooden star rested. "That's more than most folks start with," Ezra replied, checking the straps on his pack horse. "Sometimes, having nothing means you're free to become anything." His bay mare stood patient and calm, trained to trust her owner's judgment. Ezra helped Miriam up behind the saddle, showing her where to hold on for the long ride ahead. She'd never ridden double with a man who wasn't family, but these weren't normal times. As they rode out of Cedar Falls, heading toward the blue mountains that rose like sleeping giants on the horizon, Miriam looked back once at the town that had almost destroyed her. The auction block stood empty now, waiting for the next person whose life had taken a wrong turn. "How long to your cabin?" she asked, raising her voice slightly over the sound of hoofbeats on the dirt road. 2 days if we take our time," Ezra answered. "The trail gets steep, but the horses know the way. We'll camp tonight by Miller's Creek, then reach home tomorrow afternoon." Home. The word sounded strange, coming from this quiet stranger who'd paid a fortune for her freedom. What kind of man lived alone in the mountains? What did he want from her that was worth $500? And most important of all, could she trust him? Or had she simply traded one kind of danger for another? The wooden star seemed to pulse against her fingers like a tiny heartbeat, reminding her that sometimes the darkest nights produced the most beautiful light. What secrets did this mountain man carry? And would she live long enough to discover them? Thunder rumbled across the mountain peaks as Ezra's horse stumbled on the rocky trail, nearly sending both riders tumbling into the canyon below. Miriam gripped his waist tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs as loose stones scattered into the darkness beneath them. The storm had caught them halfway up the mountain, turning what should have been a peaceful journey into a fight for survival. "Hold on," Ezra called over the wind. Rain lashed their faces as he guided his mare away from the crumbling edge. Lightning split the sky, showing them glimpses of the treacherous path ahead. Miriam had never been this high in the mountains before. Back in her Amish community, the highest point had been the church bell tower. Now she felt like they were climbing toward heaven itself. If heaven came with mudslides and angry clouds. The horse slipped again, this time going down on one knee. Ezra jumped off quickly, landing in the mud with a splash. "She's favoring her left front leg," he said, running his hands along the mare's leg with gentle care. "We need shelter, fast." Miriam slid down from the saddle, her legs shaky from the long ride. Her simple dress was soaked through, and her bare feet were numb with cold. But she wasn't the helpless girl from the auction block anymore. Something had changed during their climb up this mountain. "What can I do to help?" "There's a cave about a quarter-mile ahead," Ezra said, squinting through the rain. "Can you walk that far?" He didn't wait for her answer. Instead, he grabbed the saddlebags and threw them over his shoulder. Then he did something that surprised her. He took off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, even though he was just as wet and cold. The cave turned out to be bigger than expected. It went back into the mountain far enough to keep them dry, with a sandy floor and walls that blocked the howling wind. Ezra built a small fire near the entrance, while Miriam tended to the horse's injured leg. Her father had taught her about caring for animals, and she found herself remembering his gentle voice as she worked. "You're good with animals," Ezra observed, watching her wrap the horse's leg with strips torn from her apron. "Most folks would be too scared to touch a lame horse." "Fear doesn't fix anything," Miriam replied, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "My father always said worried hands shake too much to be useful." She finished the bandage and stroked the mare's neck. "What's her name?" "Never gave her one," Ezra admitted, looking embarrassed. "Seemed too permanent." Miriam understood what he meant. After losing everyone he loved, Giving names to things made them matter too much. But sitting in this cave, with the storm raging outside and the firelight dancing on the walls, permanent didn't seem like such a scary word anymore. "She looks like a Luna to me," Miriam said softly. "Like the moon, silver and steady and beautiful." Ezra nodded slowly. "Luna it is then." They sat by the fire, sharing jerky and hardtack from Ezra's supplies. The storm showed no signs of stopping, and Miriam found herself studying her mysterious savior in the flickering light. His hands were scarred from years of hard work, but they moved with surprising gentleness when he fed twigs to the fire. His eyes held sadness that reminded her of her own grief, but also something else. Kindness that hadn't been beaten out of him by loss. "Why did you buy me?" she asked suddenly. The question had been burning inside her for 2 days. Ezra was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally he spoke. "Had a daughter once. She'd be about your age now, if the fever hadn't taken her. When I saw you up on that block, looking scared but not broken." He poked at the fire with a stick. Figured nobody should have to face that alone. The simple honesty of his words hit her harder than any sermon she'd ever heard. Here was a man who had lost everything, yet still had room in his heart to help a stranger. "I'm sorry about your daughter," she said. "Me too." He looked at her across the fire. "What about you? How'd you end up in that place?" So Miriam told him. About her parents dying within days of each other from the wasting sickness. About the community debts that had piled up like winter snow. About Isaac Brennan and the other church leaders who had decided that selling her was better than helping her. She told him about her little brother who had carved the wooden star before the fever took him too. "Sounds like your brother was the only one with real faith in that whole community," Ezra said when she finished. "What makes you say that?" "Real faith means believing good things can happen, even when everything looks hopeless. Like carving a star for someone you love, even when you're dying." He reached into his pack and pulled out a small piece of wood and his carving knife. "Mind if I try?" Miriam watched, fascinated, as his scarred hands began to shape the wood. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside their small circle of firelight, something peaceful was growing. She found herself talking about things she had never shared with anyone. Her secret dreams of seeing the ocean someday. Her love of reading, which the church leaders had called prideful. Her questions about God that had gotten her in trouble with the deacons. "Questions aren't sins," Ezra said, still carving. "If God didn't want us to wonder about things, He wouldn't have given us minds that never stop thinking." By the time the storm passed the next morning, Luna's leg was much better, and Miriam felt like a different person. The scared girl from the auction block was still there, but she was wrapped now in something stronger. Hope, maybe, or just the knowledge that she wasn't completely alone in the world. As they packed up to continue their journey, Ezra handed her the wooden star he had carved during the night. It was perfect, smooth and symmetrical, with tiny details that must have taken hours to complete. "For luck," he said simply. Miriam held both stars in her palm, her brother's rough one and Ezra's polished one. Together, they felt like a promise that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over yet. The cabin appeared through the pine trees like something from a fairy tale, but not the scary kind. This was the type of place where woodcutters might be kind, and wolves might be friends. Miriam had expected something rough and temporary, like the lean-tos she'd seen traveling peddlers use. Instead, Ezra's home was solid and welcoming, with glass windows that caught the morning sunlight, and a garden where vegetables grew in neat rows beside wildflowers. "It's beautiful," she breathed, sliding down from Luna's back. Her legs were stiff from the long ride, but her heart felt lighter than it had in months. The air here was different from the valley below. Cleaner, somehow, and full of pine scent that made her want to breathe deeper. "Built it myself, after," Ezra's voice trailed off. But Miriam understood. After his family died, after his old life ended, and he needed to create something new from the pieces that remained, she followed him inside, marveling at the careful craftsmanship. The logs fit together perfectly, with no gaps for wind or rain to sneak through. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with shelves full of books nearby. Real books, more than she'd ever seen in one place. "The spare room is through there," Ezra said, pointing to a door on the far side of the main room. "Locks on the inside, like I promised." The room was small but comfortable, with a real bed covered by a quilt that must have been made by someone who loved the person sleeping under it. A window looked out toward the mountains, and Miriam could see for miles across valleys filled with golden aspen trees. She set her few belongings on the wooden chest at the foot of the bed, including both wooden stars. That first week passed like a gentle dream. Miriam discovered that mountain life had its own rhythm, different from the strict schedules of her Amish upbringing. Here, work got done when it needed doing, but there was also time for rest and wonder. She learned to milk Ezra's cow Bessie, who was friendlier than any animal she'd ever known. She gathered eggs from chickens that seemed happy to see her each morning. But the biggest surprise was how much she enjoyed cooking for someone again. Ezra ate her biscuits like they were made of gold, and praised her vegetable soup until she blushed. After months of grief and worry, it felt wonderful to see someone smile because of something she had made. "You don't have to do all this," Ezra said one evening, watching her mend a tear in his shirt. "I hired you to." "Well, I guess I never actually said what I hired you for." "You saved me," Miriam replied, threading her needle with careful precision. "That's worth more work than I could do in a lifetime." "Nobody should have to earn their safety," Ezra said quietly. "Safety should be free, like air or water." His words made her chest tight with emotion she couldn't name. In her old community, everything had a price. God's love came with obedience. Community support came with conformity. Even family affection seemed to depend on following rules that changed whenever the leaders decided they should. But here in this mountain cabin, Ezra offered safety with no strings attached. The peaceful routine was broken on a Tuesday morning, when Miriam woke to find Ezra collapsed by the wood stove, his skin burning with fever. She had seen this sickness before. It was the same wasting fever that had taken her parents, the one that could kill strong adults in days if it wasn't fought properly. Fear made her hands shake as she helped him to his bed, but she forced herself to be calm. Panic never saved anyone. She remembered every remedy her mother had taught her, every herb her father had shown her in their garden. The mountain meadows were full of healing plants if she knew where to look. For 3 days, she barely left his side. She brewed teas from willow bark for the fever and made broths from whatever vegetables she could find. When he became too weak to sit up, she spooned liquid into his mouth drop by drop. When the fever made him ramble about his dead wife and daughter, she held his hand and spoke in gentle tones until the nightmares passed. On the second night, when his fever spiked so high she feared losing him, Miriam found herself praying harder than she ever had in church. Not the formal prayers of her childhood, but desperate words from her heart. "Please," she whispered to whatever power might be listening, "don't let me lose someone else. Not when I've just found hope again." The fever broke on the 4th morning. Miriam woke in the chair beside his bed to find Ezra watching her with clear eyes. "You stayed," he said, his voice rough but rational. "Of course I stayed," she replied, suddenly embarrassed by how she must look after days without proper rest. "Where else would I go?" "Most folks would have taken what they could carry and headed for town," Ezra said. "Left me to face it alone." "I'm not most folks," Miriam said firmly. "And you're not alone anymore." Something changed between them in that moment. Not love, exactly, but recognition. They were both survivors, both people who had learned that life could be cruel, but were still willing to fight for goodness when they found it. As Ezra grew stronger, Miriam explored more of the mountain. She found a meadow where late-season berries grew wild and sweet. She discovered a stream where mountain trout swam in pools so clear she could count their spots. She even found the courage to climb to a high ridge where she could see for hundreds of miles in every direction. Standing on that ridge, with the wind in her hair and the whole world spread out below her, Miriam realized something important. The girl who had stood on the auction block in fear and shame was gone. In her place was someone stronger, someone who could save a man's life, and explore unknown mountains, and sleep peacefully under stars that blazed like promises in the darkness. "I'm free," she said aloud, and the mountains echoed her words back to her like an answer. When she returned to the cabin that evening, she found Ezra sitting by the fire, carving another wooden star. This one was different from the first, more complex, with tiny flowers carved around its edges. "For the woman who saved my life," he said, offering it to her with a smile that transformed his whole face. Miriam took the star and added it to the growing collection on her windowsill. 3 stars now, each one marking a step in her journey from despair to hope. She wondered how many more stars her new life might hold. Thunder rolled across the mountains like a warning drum as 3 horses appeared through the morning mist, their riders dark shapes against the gray sky. Miriam dropped the bucket of chicken feed she'd been carrying, her heart hammering against her ribs as she recognized the man in front, Isaac Brennan, the deacon whose cold eyes had watched her family fall apart without lifting a finger to help. "Well, well," Brennan called out, his voice carrying the same cruel satisfaction she remembered from church meetings where he'd spoken about God's punishment for the wicked. "The lost sheep thinks she can hide in the wilderness." Behind him rode 2 men Miriam had never seen before, one thin as a fence post, with nervous hands that kept fidgeting with his reins, the other broad-shouldered with the kind of mean smile that made children cross the street. Both wore the plain clothes of her former community, but something in their eyes reminded her more of the men who had jeered at the auction block. Ezra emerged from his workshop, moving with the quiet purpose of a man who'd learned to read danger in the tilt of a stranger's head. His rifle hung loose in his hands, but Miriam noticed how his thumb rested near the hammer. "Morning," he said, his voice level as still water. "You gentlemen lost?" "Not lost," Brennan replied, dismounting with the stiff movements of someone unused to long rides. "Found exactly what we came for." His gaze fixed on Miriam like a hawk spotting a rabbit. "Miriam Yoder, you will gather your things. These good men have volunteered to escort you back where you belong." The thin man shifted in his saddle, and Miriam caught the glint of metal beneath his coat. Her mouth went dry. These weren't just community elders come to talk. They'd come prepared for trouble. "I belong here," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "This is my home now." Brennan's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Your home? Living in sin with this mountain savage? Do you think God doesn't see what happens in these godless hills?" Ezra took a step forward, and the air between the men crackled like lightning before a storm. "Careful with your words, preacher man. They might be the last ones you speak." But Miriam moved between them, her hands raised. Violence wouldn't solve this. It would only prove Brennan right about the mountain being a place of lawlessness. "Isaac, why now? I've been gone for months. Why come all this way?" The deacon's smile was cold as winter wind. "Because your shameful story has spread, girl. People talk. They say Miriam Yoder lives like a wife to a mountain man. No marriage vows spoken, no blessing given. Your sin makes our whole community look weak." "What people?" Miriam pressed. "Who exactly is talking?" The broad-shouldered man spoke for the first time, his voice rough as tree bark. "Does it matter? Sin is sin, whether one person knows or 100. But Miriam had caught something in Brennan's face, a flicker of uncertainty, when she'd asked about the gossip. "There is no sin here," she said firmly. "Ezra Callahan has shown me nothing but kindness and respect. He's never asked for anything except honest work for honest shelter." "Lies," the thin man spat, finally finding his voice. "We know what goes on between men and women when they're alone together. It's the nature of flesh to corrupt." Ezra's knuckles whitened on his rifle grip. "Mister, you'd best watch how you speak about the lady." Thunder crashed closer now, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. The horses stamped and whinnied, sensing the storm's approach. Brennan pulled his coat tighter and gestured to his companions. "Enough talk. Miriam, you're coming with us. We have families ready to take you in. Good Christian families who will help you find proper marriage and redemption. What families? Miriam demanded. The Stoltzfus family who turned their backs when my mother needed medicine? The Millers who wouldn't even look at my father when the bank came for our farm? Which of those good Christian families want me now? The deacon's face darkened. Pride goes before a fall, girl. You've forgotten your place. Rain began falling harder, turning the clearing's dust to mud. The thin man's horse shied at another thunder crash, nearly unseating its rider. Through the growing downpour, Miriam could see doubt creeping into the man's face. This wasn't the easy retrieval they'd expected. My place, Miriam said, her voice rising above the storm, is wherever I choose to make it, not where men like you decide to put me. Brennan's hand moved towards something under his coat, but Ezra was faster. The rifle came up smooth as silk, and suddenly the deacon found himself staring down a barrel that had put food on this mountain table for 8 years straight. I wouldn't, Ezra said quietly. The broad-shouldered man reached for his own weapon, but stopped when he realized his horse was spinning in nervous circles, spooked by the lightning. In the chaos of the storm and frightened animals, what had seemed like a simple capture was turning into something far more dangerous. This isn't over, Brennan shouted over the thunder, water streaming from his hat brim. The community won't forget this defiance. The community already forgot me, Miriam shouted back. When they put me on that auction block like a piece of livestock, they made their choice. Now, I've made mine. The storm raged for 3 hours, forcing the unwelcome visitors to take shelter in Ezra's barn while he and Miriam waited in the cabin. Through the rain-streaked window, they could see the shapes of the 3 men huddled near the horses, their earlier confidence washed away by the mountain weather that seemed to fight against them. Miriam paced the small room like a caged animal, her hands trembling with anger she'd kept buried for months. They think they can just ride up here and drag me back like a runaway cow, she muttered, pausing to peer through the curtains, as if I owe them something after what they did to my family. Ezra sat at his wooden table, cleaning his rifle with steady, practiced movements. What exactly did they do? He asked quietly. You've mentioned debts, but never the whole story. The question hung in the air between them, like smoke from a dying fire. Miriam had never told anyone the complete truth about why her family had lost everything. The shame of it had eaten at her like acid. But now, facing Brennan's cruel righteousness, she found the words spilling out. My father wasn't just a farmer, she began, sinking into the chair across from Ezra. He was the community's record keeper, the man who tracked tithing and helped settle disputes about money. When the crop failures hit in 1879 and 1880, families started falling behind on their church contributions. Thunder rolled overhead, but quieter now, the storm moving away toward distant peaks. Ezra continued cleaning his weapon, giving her the space to speak without the pressure of his full attention. Father started using his own money to cover for families who couldn't pay, Miriam continued. He thought it was temporary, that the next harvest would set things right. But the drought kept going, and more families needed help. Before long, he'd borrowed against our farm to keep the community finances balanced. And Brennan knew about this? Ezra asked. Miriam's laugh was bitter as burnt coffee. Brennan demanded it. He said the church's reputation depended on never appearing weak or poor to the outside world. When English merchants came collecting debts, everything had to look prosperous and stable. Father was trapped between helping his neighbors and satisfying Brennan's pride. Through the window, she could see the thin man emerging from the barn, looking miserable and soaked despite the shelter. The reality of mountain life was clearly different from whatever stories had brought him here. When Father got sick, the books didn't balance anymore, Miriam went on. Brennan claimed he knew nothing about the private loans, said Father had acted without authority. The community voted to let our farm be sold, rather than admit their leader had pressured one man into financial ruin. Ezra set down his cleaning cloth, and really looked at her for the first time since she'd started talking. That's why you were on the auction block. They were selling you to cover the difference. The final humiliation, she agreed. Get rid of the troublesome daughter who might tell people what really happened. Let some stranger take me far away, where I couldn't embarrass anyone with the truth. The sound of horses moving outside made them both turn toward the window. The three visitors were mounting up, clearly having decided that a continued confrontation in hostile weather wasn't worth the risk. But as they prepared to ride away, Brennan called out one final threat. This isn't finished, Miriam Yoder. The community has a long memory, and there are other ways to deal with stubborn sheep who wander from the flock. Miriam stood and walked to the door, pulling it open despite the damp cold that rushed in. My name is Miriam Callahan now, she called back, the lie coming to her lips without planning. And your flock threw me out, remember? You have no claim on me anymore. Brennan's face went white with rage. You're not married to this heathen. I see no ring, no certificate, no blessing from any proper church. Marriage isn't about papers and rings, Miriam replied, feeling Ezra move to stand behind her in the doorway. It's about two people choosing to build something together, to protect and care for each other through good times and bad. That's more than your community ever offered my family. The broad-shouldered man spat into the mud. Pretty words won't save you when the law comes calling. There are still rules in this territory, even on God-forsaken mountains. But his companion, the thin, nervous man, was already backing his horse away from the cabin. We should go, he said urgently. The weather's clearing, but it'll be dark soon. These mountain trails aren't safe at night. For a long moment, Brennan stared at Miriam with the frustrated fury of a man whose authority had been questioned and found wanting. Then he wheeled his horse around and spurred it toward the trail, his followers scrambling to keep up. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Miriam realized she was shaking not with fear, but with the strange lightness that comes after finally speaking a truth that's been buried too long. Miriam Callahan? Ezra asked quietly. She turned to face him, suddenly aware of what she'd claimed in the heat of the moment. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. It just came out, and I thought it might make them leave us alone. But Ezra was smiling, the first real smile she'd seen from him since the day he'd brought her to the mountain. It has a nice sound to it, he said. If you're interested in making it more than just words to scare off unwanted visitors. The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. And for the first time since arriving at the mountain cabin, Miriam felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Thunder rolled across the mountain peaks like an angry giant's voice, but the real storm was brewing in Isaac Brennan's eyes as he sat straighter in his saddle. The deacon had not ridden 3 days through rough Wyoming Territory trails just to be turned away by a woman who should have been grateful for rescue. Behind him, his two companions shifted nervously, their horses dancing sideways as if sensing the tension that crackled worse than the lightning overhead. Miriam Yoder, you forget yourself, Brennan declared, his voice carrying the same tone he used for Sunday sermons back in their Pennsylvania settlement. Your parents raised you better than this shameful display. Think of their memory before you speak such harsh words about God's chosen community. The mention of her parents hit Miriam like a physical blow, but instead of crumbling, something fierce blazed to life behind her dark eyes. She stepped forward, no longer the frightened girl who had stood on that auction block months ago. Don't you dare speak of my parents, Isaac. Where was God's chosen community when Mama needed medicine we couldn't afford? Where were you when Papa worked himself into the grave, trying to pay your endless church taxes? Ezra watched the exchange with growing tension, his weathered hands steady on his rifle but his mind racing. He had seen men like Brennan before, righteous in their own minds, dangerous in their certainty. The mountain man knew this confrontation would not end with simple words, not when pride and power were at stake. Years of solitary living had taught him to read the subtle signs of violence brewing, and every instinct screamed that trouble was coming fast. You speak of taxes as if they were robbery, one of Brennan's companions called out, a younger man with pale skin and nervous eyes. The church provides spiritual guidance worth far more than silver coins. Your family's debts came from poor choices, not faithful giving. The words hung in the mountain air like poison smoke. Miriam felt her breath catch, memories flooding back of her father's bent shoulders as he worked their small farm dawn to dusk, never complaining even when the community demanded more than they could give. She remembered her mother's quiet tears when they sold her grandmother's wedding ring to meet the church's latest demand for building funds. Poor choices? Miriam's voice grew stronger with each word, like trusting people who claimed to follow Christ's teachings about caring for the poor and sick, like believing that community meant helping each other instead of bleeding families dry for fancy church buildings. Thunder crashed overhead, closer now, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. But nobody moved toward shelter. The storm inside this mountain clearing was far more dangerous than anything nature could throw at them. Brennan's face darkened, like the sky above. Your tongue has grown sharp living among the English, child. This mountain hermit has filled your head with worldly ideas that lead only to damnation. Come home now, and we can still find you a proper husband willing to overlook your circumstances. Ezra's jaw tightened at the word circumstances, understanding exactly what the deacon implied. The suggestion that Miriam had been anything less than completely honorable during her time at his cabin sparked anger that had been building since these men first rode into his peaceful clearing. Circumstances? Ezra's voice carried a quiet menace that made the horses sidestep nervously. You mean the circumstance of being sold like livestock because your community failed her? Or maybe you mean the circumstance of working hard every day to earn her keep through honest labor? Rain fell steadier now, turning dust to mud beneath their feet. Miriam felt water running down her face, mixing with tears she hadn't realized were falling. But these weren't tears of fear or shame, they were tears of fury at years of suppressed resentment finally finding voice. I know what you really want, Isaac, she said, her words cutting through the rain's hiss. You want to drag me back as an example. The wayward girl brought low, forced to marry whoever will have her, living proof that leaving the community leads to ruin. But I won't be your cautionary tale. The youngest of Brennan's men, barely more than a boy, spoke up suddenly. Deacon, maybe she's right. Maybe we should just— Silence, Daniel, Brennan snapped. This woman has clearly been corrupted beyond simple redemption. But corruption can be cleansed through proper discipline and prayer. Something cold settled in Ezra's chest at those words. He had heard similar talk before, years ago, when traveling through communities that believed suffering was the path to salvation. What kind of discipline are we talking about, Deacon? Brennan smiled. And it wasn't a kind expression. The kind that reminds prideful women of their place in God's order. A few weeks of fasting and prayer, isolated from worldly temptations, works wonders for stubborn spirits. The threat was clear now, hanging between them like the smell of gunpowder. Miriam felt ice in her veins, despite the warm rain, remembering stories whispered among the women back home about girls who had been corrected by the church elders. But before fear could paralyze her, she felt Ezra move closer, his solid presence at her shoulder, reminding her that she wasn't alone anymore. The wooden star in her pocket seemed to grow warm against her palm, her brother's love reaching across death to strengthen her resolve. No, she said simply, the word carrying more power than any sermon Brennan had ever preached. I won't be going anywhere with you, Isaac. Not today, not ever. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the deadly serious expressions on every face in the clearing, and everyone knew that words alone would not settle this storm. Morning sunlight streamed through frost-covered windows, painting rainbow patterns across the cabin's wooden walls, where dozens of carved stars caught and scattered the light like tiny suns. 6 months had passed since that terrible confrontation in the rain, and Miriam could barely remember the frightened girl who had once stood on an auction block in Cedar Falls. She moved through the familiar morning routine with quiet confidence, her hands sure and steady as she prepared breakfast and tended the fire that had never gone cold since winter's arrival. Outside, she could hear Ezra splitting wood for their daily needs, the rhythmic sound of his axe mixing with bird songs that promised spring's return to the high mountains. Their life together had settled into comfortable patterns that felt as natural as breathing, built on mutual respect and shared work rather than desperate need or romantic fairy tales. The events of that stormy October day had changed everything. When Brennan finally realized that neither threats nor religious arguments would move her, he had made one last attempt to assert his authority. But Ezra's quiet competence with his rifle, combined with Miriam's unwavering refusal to be intimidated, had sent the deacon and his men back down the mountain with their pride badly wounded and their mission failed. More importantly, that confrontation had forced Miriam to speak truths she had never dared voice before, even to herself. Standing up to Isaac, Brennan had been like breaking chains she hadn't realized were binding her spirit. Every word of defiance had made her stronger, until she finally understood that her worth had never depended on anyone else's approval. Now, as she arranged fresh bread and honey on the simple wooden table, Miriam reflected on how different her life had become from anything she had imagined as a young Amish girl. She wore practical mountain clothes instead of plain gray dresses, spoke her mind instead of keeping silent, and made decisions based on her own judgment rather than community rules. The door opened, and Ezra entered, bringing cold morning air and the scent of pine sap. His hair was grayer now than when they first met, and lines around his eyes spoke of laughter shared through the long winter evenings. He had changed too. She realized the deep loneliness that had marked him when they first met had gradually lifted, replaced by contentment she suspected he had forgotten was possible. "Storm coming in from the west," he said, hanging his coat on its peg and washing his hands in the basin by the door. "Should hit by afternoon. Good thing we finished clearing that deadfall from the trail yesterday." Miriam nodded, pouring coffee into two chipped but cherished cups. Weather talk had become their gentle way of starting each day, grounding themselves in practical concerns before moving into deeper conversations. She had learned to read mountain weather, almost as well as Ezra, understanding how clouds moving across distant peaks could affect their isolated valley. "I was thinking," she said, as they sat down to eat, "about Daniel Hoffman, the boy who rode with Brennan that day." Ezra raised an eyebrow, remembering the youngest of their unwelcome visitors, the one who had seemed uncomfortable with his companion's harsh intentions. "What about him?" He asked questions that showed he was thinking for himself, not just following orders. "Made me wonder if there might be others back in the settlement who are starting to see through Isaac's rigid control." Miriam spread honey on warm bread, her movements thoughtful. What if change is coming whether the deacons want it or not? It was an interesting idea, and one that showed how Miriam's thinking had expanded beyond her own situation to consider the bigger picture. Ezra had watched her grow into someone who could see connections and possibilities that the frightened girl on the auction block never could have imagined. "Change usually comes slow to places like that," he said carefully, "but sometimes one person asking hard questions can start something bigger than they know." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about community, belonging, and the courage it took to live according to your own conscience, rather than other people's expectations. Outside, the wind was picking up, confirming Ezra's weather prediction and reminding them both how much they had learned about reading signs and preparing for whatever storms might come. After breakfast, as Miriam began her daily tasks, she found herself thinking about all the different kinds of auctions life presented. Some were obvious, like the terrible day in Cedar Falls when her body had been sold to settle debts. But there were subtler auctions too, moments when you had to decide whether to sell your principles for acceptance, your dreams for security, your authentic self for the approval of others. She had been put up for bid so many times in her life, she realized, usually by people who claimed to care about her soul. But the real miracle wasn't that Ezra had outbid the others that day. The miracle was learning that she had never been for sale in the first place. The wooden stars scattered throughout their cabin caught afternoon light from different angles, each one representing a stage in her journey from shame to strength. Some carved by her dead brother's loving hands, others by Ezra during long winter evenings, and now several made by her own fingers as she learned skills never taught to proper Amish girls. As predicted, storm clouds gathered over the mountain peaks. Miriam felt no fear of the approaching weather. She and Ezra were prepared with firewood, food, and most importantly, the unshakable knowledge that they had built something real together. Not a desperate clinging to each other against loneliness, but a partnership based on choice, respect, and shared understanding of what truly mattered in life. Thunder rolled in the distance, but this time it sounded like applause rather than threat. The stars would shine again when the storm passed, just as they always had, just as they always would,